Hello and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and it's been a hot minute since I've done a video. This evening I have for you a review of His Dark Materials trilogy by Philip Pullman, which includes Northern Lights, The Subtle Knife, and finally The Amber Spyglass. Now this was my last reread of the year. The first time I read this trilogy I was about 13 years old, so it's been a while. And I was really excited for my reread, and overall it was a positive experience, though I will say this outright, my rating for it went down just a little bit. And I also read, well, I just finished last night, La Belle Sauvage, which is the first volume in the newest His Dark Materials Universe trilogy, The Book of Dust. But, I mean, I'll do a series review for that trilogy whenever it finishes, because the third one hasn't been published yet, but I'll certainly talk about it in my monthly reading wrap-up. So His Dark Materials is I would call it a children's fantasy series, or at least young teen fantasy series. I think it's been rebranded as YA, though it wasn't quite YA when I bought them when I was 12, 13, so whatever, it doesn't really matter. And besides, you can definitely read this as an adult. It's quite deep and brainy, I think, for children's literature. I think it's primarily fantasy, though I would argue there are a few science fiction elements in it, because, and this is not really a spoiler because this is stated at the beginning of Northern Lights, these books feature parallel universes, and I feel like that's more of a science fiction plot device than a fantasy one. But then you also have just science-based elements, which is why I would argue you could say there is an element of SF in there, but it's primarily fantasy. It's a trilogy with a straightforward narrative structure, and no like flashbacks or things like that, and there are multiple points of view, at least for books 2 and 3. No, actually for Northern Lights as well, multiple points of view. And there is a main child female character for the whole trilogy, but she's really the main character of the first book, I would argue, called Lyra the Lacquer. And another feature for which this trilogy is well known is that it tackles religious themes and religious motifs. Now, the author is a self-avowed atheist, so there has been a bit of controversy around these books because it has been deemed to be religion bashing and church bashing, etc. I'm going to talk about that in the themes. I don't think it's nearly quite as bad as people make it out to be, but I'll get back to that. So the basic premise, for Northern Lights at least, because I'm going to try and keep this review as spoiler-free as I can, I will have a section towards the end where I go into spoilers to talk about my impressions and that. So you have the character of Lyra, who is living in Oxford, England, but it's an alternative version of our world, though our world also features in the trilogy. Like I said, there are parallel universes. What's very particular about this universe is that people's souls exist outside of their physical bodies in the form of an animal. That animal can change shape when the person is a child, and then around puberty, the animal shape settles into a single form, which you keep until you die. And the plot revolves around a central conflict between the church, called the Magisterium, and Lyra's uncle, Lord Asriel, who is exploring the North Pole and doing strange experiments around something called dust and consciousness, and just going up against the church. And Lyra, well, gets embroiled in that, and also with an instrument called the alethiometer, which allows her to divine things, if you will. It's a truth reader. I'll leave it at that. It's really the sparsest way I could describe the basic premise. Develops a lot from that point forward. Writing-wise, I think you can definitely say that Philip Pullman knows how to write. I enjoyed his prose. I think it's actually quite a rich vocabulary and a fairly adult writing style, like for a children's series. I enjoyed his level of English, I guess is the best way of putting it. Concise sentences, but also sometimes fairly poetic passages, very thoughtful, thought-provoking, and evocative. And what I enjoyed is that he really knows how to make his story, his characters and his setting come to life by using like different accents, putting in a fairly rich vocabulary, like I said, but also contrasting that with like vernacular elements to either evoke characters from different countries or different socio-economic classes, things like that. I can't really say much more than that, but yeah, I think it's really well written for a children's YA series. Now, when it comes to character work, this reread was interesting. I now find that the character work is kind of a mixed bag. We have Lyra, which is a truly striking character, at least in book one. She's spiffy, mischievous, clever, resourceful, very active. Not the kind of kid I would have gotten along with when I was a child myself, mind you. But still a very striking, well-fleshed out character. She will stick in your mind. And you have other well-fleshed out characters. You have witch characters, the foremost of which is a woman named Serafina Pacula. You have, in the first book, polar bears which wear armor and can talk with humans. You have one polar bear character called Irek Burnison, who's also just gonna stick in your mind. You have Lord Asriel, Lyra's uncle, and there's a twist with that. And then you have like the main antagonist, or one of the main antagonists, who is called Marisa Coulter, or just Mrs. Coulter, with a very striking golden-haired monkey demon, and she works for the church called the Magisterium. But what I noticed is that with books 2 and 3, 1, you have a multiplication of points of view and characters, and so you lose depth with the new characters especially. Now, in book 2, sorry, minor spoiler, you have the introduction of another main protagonist, a male child. I mean, Lyra and Will are children, though they're older children, close to teenagehood, they're about 12 years old. Will is also a very well-defined character with a strong sense of loyalty and responsibility because he has a mentally ill mother he has to look after, and his father disappeared when he was, well, around 1 year old, and that's important to the plot. And he also has a bit of a, like, violent side, but also very thoughtful, very quiet, a bit precocious in a way, at least with regards to maturity, because he has to take on a lot of responsibilities at a young age. But he kind of overshadows Lyra in books 2 and 3. And I hate to say this, but it's almost like Lyra becomes a bit submissive. I do not want to use the sexist word here, because I don't think that was the intent in any case. But yeah, it felt off to me. I'm like, really, this strong girl character who's so full of life, and she's even quite stubborn and resourceful and clever, perhaps not in an intellectual way, but she finds ways to figure things out. And she kind of takes a back seat and she becomes very mopey and wimpy, which is understandable given what happens to her, but still, and like Will is the guy who steps in to comfort her, and it becomes a bit tropey in a bad way. And the fact is that kind of happens with another important female character, which I mentioned, the main antagonist, Mrs. Coulter, and something happens to her character where her evolution doesn't feel natural. It feels a bit forced, convenient for the plot, but the problem is the way it's done, it falls into a female stereotype. And I didn't really like that. So you had some stereotyping going on, which is acceptable, I guess. Or at least it's understandable, because the thing is, Philip Pullman wanted to really examine a biblical motif and reinterpret it in these books. And I wonder if the character work didn't suffer from him really wanting to push forward that biblical motif, or I mean its reinterpretation. That's my theory in any case. World building wise, I still maintain that for a younger audience, this trilogy is amazing. But I reread it as an adult, and having read other fantasy works, adult fantasy and adult science fiction, and being the person that I am, I'm just a nitpicky bitch. That's how my brain works. I did find holes that bothered me, but still, it is good world building for what it is overall. Especially with regards to that one version of our universe that has demons in it. Demons are an awesome concept. I loved that as a kid. I still really thoroughly enjoyed it, though I would argue that kind of person's personality, soul, whatever, truly be encompassed by just one animal. Like, even in cultures that have the concept of a totem animal, oftentimes a person can have more than one, actually, to either reflect aspects of their personality or just to guide them on different aspects of their life paths. Anyway, so I was like, yeah, but like, shouldn't a person have maybe a demon that can take 2 or 3 different shapes? Like, the multiplicity of forms in childhood somewhat makes sense because the child is developing into his or her own personality. But I'm like, just one animal when you're a teenager and an adult until you die? Really? But that's a minor quibble. And just seeing the little ways in which Lyra's Oxford in England was different to, well, our own versions was really neat. Like, electricity in that world is called ambaric power because it comes from amber, but amber itself is a word coming, I think, from the Greek for like lightning or something. So that, I just love that. It's kind of like an alternative history vibe to it. But the holes, like I said, okay, so it kind of starts to fall apart. That's a bit harsh. It doesn't fall apart, but like I said, there is heavy or very present religious theming in these books. Philip Pullman was trying to reinterpret the fall of humankind from Genesis and the Bible, which is fine, but it didn't all fit together, in my opinion. The way the plot is set up, you've got this big conflict between the religious authorities, which are labeled as Christian, basically, and the side of freedom of thought, atheism, though it's not called that, and things like that. It felt a bit false because it's not really shown just how evil or all-encompassing the church is. In fact, I was like, it was actually worse during like the Inquisition in Europe, in our world. It's not even as bad as that in Lyra's world. Certainly not in our universe, which, like I said, is present in this trilogy, and not in some of the other universes you get to in books 2 and 3. So that was a bit confusing. If the church is that powerful and that evil, show it. Like, alright, you have the Magisterium, which has its headquarters in Geneva, and they do fucked up stuff to children, but it's still not present enough in a weird way. It might be addressed a wee bit in the trilogy The Book of Dust, but you shouldn't have to rely on a new trilogy published, 15 years later to get that world building, I feel. And then with regards to like the overall cosmology of the story, talks about God and angels and things like that, but you also have witches, which are pagan, with their own female deity. You have these polar bears, which are beasts, and they don't have gods at all. They're just beasts of the earth, and they think that when they die, they just go back to the earth. And presumably other universes have different, faith systems, or not. And in our own world, it is like our own world in the 90s or maybe the early 2000s, and we're not living under a theocracy, at least not in Western Europe. So I don't know. I think there was a problem there. It wasn't convincing enough to my adult mind in any case. It was more believable when I was younger, even though I was already thinking about a lot of this stuff. I guess I was just more immersed in the story. But the themes is where this trilogy gets all its controversy, which I don't really think is that deserved, to be honest. I do believe that part of the genesis of this trilogy has to do with Philip Pullman wanting to react to the Chronicles of Narnia. And Philip Pullman is an atheist, I believe, and so he wanted to tackle the theme of religious authority and religious abuse and, freedom of thought, freedom of consciousness, and things like that. So all of the theming basically revolves around that general category. Theme 1, which is also a motif, is the fall of humankind, the fall from grace, the expulsion from paradise, the garden, etc. And he reinterprets it in a more positive light because he's basically arguing that it's a good thing. It's what gave us knowledge, wisdom, and parallel to that, I would say, is the theme of innocence versus experience. And as a matter of fact, there are lots of William Blake quotes in The Amber Spyglass. That I really loved. I remember that from reading it as a young teen. At the start of each chapter in The Amber Spyglass, you have a quote from either John Milton's Paradise Lost, from William Blake's writings, from other poets, or philosophers. I love William Blake. I more love his illustration work, but I love Songs of Innocence and Experience, so that's very relevant, because innocence versus experience is definitely a theme in there. But that's tied directly into the fall of humankind, because that's what it's about, really. Humankind losing its heavenly innocence and going down into the world of earthly material experience. Now, according to the church, that's something bad, and Philip Pullman is trying to argue through his narrative that, no, that's actually a good thing. We should learn and be wise and question things and question authority, especially. And that's directly tied in to the demons and to this thing called dust and to consciousness, etc. But it's a motif he really wanted to work into his books, and like I said, I feel like the plot and the character work suffered a bit from it, because it just had to fit in neatly, and sometimes it just didn't, in my opinion, develop organically. It felt forced. And it's to a point where it's directly said in the books, it's a minor spoiler again, that there will be a second fall from grace. So yeah, I'm going to call it, from now, the Fall 2.0. A second theme, which is linked to the first one, obviously, is that of free will and destiny. Are we truly in charge of our lives? Can we change its course fundamentally, or is it set since our birth, or even from before our birth? How do authority figures, authoritarian institutions bear upon that, etc.? And then another theme, I think that's a more minor, it plays a part in the story in a very specific way, and I think he's going to develop that particular theme in the new trilogy, The Book of Dust. It's that of the nature of reality and consciousness more specifically. So yeah, because demons are human soul, and that's directly tied to consciousness, and there's a whole cosmology in his Dark Materials which addresses reality, the soul, death, life after death, and things like that. It questions a lot of that in a more materialistic / potentially atheistic way, which is fine, but not nearly as bad or extreme as some people think. I'll get back to that in the spoiler section. So yeah, they're quite heavy themes actually for children / young teens literature. Well, you know what? Maybe that's exactly the kind of heavy stuff we should start thinking about when we're younger. That's actually my opinion. Some people might disagree with that, but I've been thinking about religion, spirituality, faith, consciousness, and things like that since I was fairly young myself, so I didn't mind. I enjoyed that quite a bit. But yeah, it's definitely heavier in its themes, quite deep, very thoughtful. If nothing else, it will make you think. Now, I don't know if this is because I reread it as an adult after having read it as a young person. But like I said, I could kind of pick some holes in there, and it bothered me, and I think it has a lot of depth for a younger audience, is my point. I think you can definitely find it very thought-provoking and thoughtful as an adult if these are themes you don't normally think about in general, maybe, is what I'm trying to say. I've been thinking about this stuff for a long time, so to me it was entry-level stuff. Maybe for someone who just doesn't think about these kinds of things on a regular basis, for them it's a refreshing, thought-provoking trilogy, and good for you if that's your case. So you can definitely get something out of this as an adult. It depends on what you're used to already. What are your frames of reference? What's the kind of thing you think about on a regular basis? So yeah, it's highly individually variable. But yeah, I enjoyed it a bit less as an adult, unfortunately, so I downgraded it slightly. But still, impressive for a young YA fantasy trilogy. But before I jump into the full ahead spoiler section, I did want to add one thing about the religious controversy. So yes, you can definitely, if you're a good observer, see where the materialistic atheism gets in the narrative. But I would argue it kind of gets weirdly spiritual in places. In my opinion, you could interpret it both ways, really. As someone who is not an atheist, but not a traditionally religious person either, I certainly wasn't offended. I wouldn't be offended by something that's atheist, by the way, but I could find things in there that resonated to my spiritual person, and things that didn't at all. But so it's kind of there also, it's a mixed bag. You can find spiritual content and more, atheist content, if you want to call it that. So I don't really get the controversy. Yeah, okay, it criticizes religious institutions. And guess what? Religious institutions are highly criticizable. Bloody hell, like, I'm the first one to... I can bash Abrahamic religions 1,000 times harder if I wanted than these books do, alright? So, I mean, I don't get the hoopla. Some religious people think it's too atheist. But you know what's funny? I read a comment on Goodreads from an atheist saying this wasn't atheist enough, which I found absolutely hilarious. So you see, you can totally interpret it both ways, or any way you want, really. So, yeah. Right, so this is my official last spoiler warning. If you don't want to know about specific plot elements, especially in books 2 and 3, you can come back in a minute or leave off here. I enjoyed the experience of rereading these books, but there were a couple of things that really, really rubbed me the wrong way with the plot. Because of this full 2.0 motif, Philip Pullman absolutely wanted to work into his narrative. And I talked about the character work and how I felt it suffered a bit, especially with the female characters of Lyra and Mrs. Coulter. Lyra becomes a bit submissive to Will, in my opinion. She's very weepy and frightened, which, okay, fair enough, she's still a kid. But she's shown to be the scrappy, resourceful young girl. What happened to that? And Mrs. Coulter goes from 0 to 100 on maternal instinct and love. And I didn't understand that at all. She's described as a manipulative, power-hungry, intelligent woman who has no interest whatsoever in being a mother to her only child. And then she spends a bit of time with Lyra, and she's like 35 at that point, and suddenly it clicks. She becomes enamored with her child and will go to any lengths to protect her. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that's impossible in real life for that to happen, but it felt forced. It was convenient for the plot, the way it ends with her sacrificing herself with Lord Asriel at the end there. But I'm like, really? This is the scary antagonist? I'm sorry, you don't just develop insta-love, even for your own child, when the child is 12 and you just meet them. I guess it can happen, but it didn't feel natural. But so, coming back to that full narrative, I hated so freaking much that what saves the multiverse and, dust escaping into the void is two tweens falling in love. Are you freaking kidding me? And I knew it was gonna happen because I'd read it before, but as I was reading those passages, I was like, oh my god, this is so bad. Oh my god, this is so bad. And the only reason I enjoyed that when I was 12, 13, is because I myself was falling head over heels in love with someone. So yeah, I was hopped up on hormones and tween infatuation myself, so of course I was vibing hard with that aspect of the plot. Oh my god, and yes, they love each other and they're soulmates at 12 years old. They've known each other for a few months? Really? And that's what saves the world? Really? That's what makes dust come back into the world to stick to conscious beings? Really? Come on. That was so ridiculously bad. I hated that so much. And I'm like, okay, fine, you got that scene where Lyra is feeding freaking fruit to Will to mirror Eve, giving the freaking apple to Adam. You see what I mean with Pullman forcing the plot to mirror his fall motif? I hated that so freaking hard. It was so contrived. Oh no, it was so bad. I'm sorry, but it's not quite insta-love because I did buy the friendship that was developing between them, but this idea that you can find your soulmate when you're freaking 12 years old, really? Come on, it's so ridiculous. See, that's the thing too, it's not really... How does that make dust come back into the multiverse? That doesn't even make sense. It's about consciousness. Dusts are particles of consciousness that stick to conscious organisms. Why does love, and I'm being generous with that word because I call it tween infatuation, fight me on it, I dare you. How does that coax dust back into the multiverse? How does that fight the void and the shades? There isn't even a convincing explanation for that. I don't get it. What is it, lust? Lust combats the void? I thought we were all about, lofty, abstract concepts like consciousness, intelligence, wisdom. No, it's teens getting a hard-on for each other? Really? That's what you're going with, mate. Righty then. Another thing that really, really rubbed me the wrong way. So Mary Malone, her whole thing with the Malefa, which don't get me wrong, I freaking love the Malefa. But Mary Malone, her role in the Subtle Knife is important, but then in the Amber Spyglass, and I'm sorry, that's like the title object, right? But what does it do in the end? She just sees dust, and she figures out that dust is flowing out of the universe, but ultimately it doesn't really play that big of a part in the overall plot. That whole thing could have been cut out easily. How was she the serpent tempting Lyra? I didn't get that. And the whole thing with the priest, I forget his name already, who was supposed to come and murder her. Of course he gets bumped off by an angel you thought had died before. I was like, alright, that's convenient. But that whole thing was unnecessary, ultimately. So yeah, and the whole thing where she describes, I'm sorry, but she left the church. No, that's not even the worst part, because fine, leaving the church, cool. She lost her faith in God because of an Italian man and eating marzipan. She lost her faith in God because of a spike in libido and blood sugar levels. Are you freaking kidding me? How does that make a person lose their faith? Losing one's faith is a very real thing, don't get me wrong. But usually the major life-altering events, not getting the hots for an Italian dude and eating some almond paste. That was ridiculous too. I'm sorry. I kind of question how strong her faith in the divine was before that, if that's all it took to make her lose it. And I mean, you can still have faith in God or whatever you want and not be in a religious institution like a nunnery. That bit, I would agree, is just forcing the anti-religion narrative a tad. That's fair. But that's not even what bothered me about it. It was just ridiculous. But like I said, the Malefa, I am a whore for speculative biology and weird fancy creatures that are well crafted and thoroughly described. So I love that, and their universe with the trees and the seed pods and the wheels. I thought that was very cool. And they were so sweet, so kind-hearted. I dug that, even if it ultimately was pretty not essential to the overarching story, in my opinion. And then finally, I'll address dust and the whole part of the plot that has to do with the world of the dead and death. So the whole thing about dust and death, I enjoyed that. And I remember that fondly from when I first read this trilogy. That to me can be read as highly spiritual, in fact. Some people will argue that's just classic atheist fare. You die and you don't exist anymore. But that's not even really what happens. You die and you dissolve into dust. But dust is consciousness, and your demon is made of dust. So your soul is made of dust. So your soul is consciousness, and it doesn't actually stop existing. It just dissolves into the greater whole. That's not really atheist, though. I mean, that's very Eastern philosophy, or pantheistic in a way, especially the less metaphysical branch of pantheism. You cease to exist, but you still exist in a way. You lose your ego. It's kind of like, well, ego death, which is a concept in psychedelic science, and yeah, you dissolve into the greater conscious universe. But that's not atheistic, in my opinion. You can read that as spiritual if you want to. You don't have to, but if you wanted to go the whole atheist route, you would have stuck with the polar bear philosophy. You die, and you're just dirt in the ground. But that's just my 2 cents on that. But so I like that. It's very similar to what happens in the Earthsea cycle. In the very last book, the world of the dead is dismantled, and the souls that are trapped there kind of disappear in poofs of light, or dragons made of light, whatever. Now, what's interesting, in my opinion, is that particular aspect of world building I thought was handled better in his Dark Materials than it was in the Earthsea cycle. However, I think the overall world building is tighter and self-contained in a more convincing fashion in the Earthsea cycle, but not in his Dark Materials. Like I said, I think there were several holes in the world building when it came to like the overall cosmology. So God, or what people think is God, was this really, really old angel. There might be a creatrix force out there. Who knows? But then like the witches have deities, and shamanism exists, and you can see into the future and you can project your spirit. but religious things are a bit of a lie. But then angels exist, and angels are like beings made of condensed dust. So the overall cosmology, the world building when it comes to like the metaphysical matters, isn't that cohesive. It's not watertight by any means. Except for that thing with death, which I thought was very poetic, and I don't know, I found it moving, I found it spoke to my own faith system. I don't really know what I personally believe about death and the continued existence of consciousness, but yeah, I gravitate towards that kind of thing. Now, I'm very curious to see what he's going to do with the Book of Dust, because he's supposed to go deeper with that whole concept and the matter of consciousness as is. Is consciousness something purely material, brain, or does it exist on a dual plane? Because dusts are particles of consciousness. What does that actually mean, though? I mean, okay, so we'll see where that goes. I'm very happy I read this trilogy. It was very important to me growing up. It was a reference. It's one of the book series that really impacted me. I definitely mentioned it in my 27 years of reading video. But overall, I had to downgrade it just a bit. Originally, I would have put the trilogy at an 8 out of 10. Now I would put it at a 7 or perhaps a 7.5 out of 10. So it's not a huge downgrade, but it's still a downgrade. Because I just cannot ignore the holes with the plotting, with the world building. The character work bothered me in some places. The whole thing with the fall and what saves the multiverse was just bad to me. And even like the anti-religious messaging, which doesn't bother me in and of itself, wasn't built on a terribly convincing foundation, because the church, while it does evil things, doesn't seem to be that powerful in Lyra's world. But like I said, that might be addressed in the Book of Dust, but that's not good enough. So that concludes my review for His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. If you've read these books, I'd love to hear your thoughts about them. It was fascinating to read some reviews on Goodreads, especially the ones that gave a low amount of stars. There was one review that gave 1 or 2 stars to the trilogy, and while I don't agree with the rating, I agreed with almost all of their complaints, so that was interesting. I hope you'll have a lovely day, evening, morning, whichever, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye-bye.